The pen slipped from Renata Cole's fingers. It hit the marble floor of the Ashworth Tower lobby and spun in a lazy circle before it finally clattered still near the toe of her shoe. She did not move to pick it up. Across the wide, sunlit atrium, a weary man in a faded gray work shirt stood with his hand wrapped around the small fingers of a little girl whose braids were coming loose at the ends, one purple bead clinging to a strand like it might drop at any moment. Renata was looking at the application resting on the reception desk in front of her. Applicant, Marcus Odom. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "Where did you get that name?" she asked, so quietly that her assistant, standing a few feet away with a tablet in her hands, wasn't sure at first that Renata had spoken at all. The man blinked, caught off guard. "Mom, your name." "Marcus Odom. Where does it come from?" He glanced down at his daughter, then back at the woman standing behind the desk in a charcoal suit that cost more than he'd made in the last 4 months combined. "My mother gave it to me," he said carefully, like he wasn't sure if this was a trick question or the beginning of some kind of trouble. Renata's face drained of color, because 23 years earlier, she had written that exact name on the back of a photograph, and then folded that photograph into the lining of an old coat, and put the coat in a box, and put the box somewhere she had told herself, over and over, she would never look again. And the man standing in front of her, in his cleanest shirt, with his daughter's hand in his, had absolutely no idea why the name meant anything at all. Marcus Odom had applied for the janitorial position at Ashworth Tower because his rent was due in 4 days, and that was the plain truth of it, unglamorous and unavoidable. At 39 years old, he had spent most of his working life fixing things other people didn't know how to fix. First as an HVAC apprentice, then for almost a decade as a certified elevator mechanic, climbing into the guts of some of the tallest buildings in Atlanta with a tool belt around his waist and a headlamp clipped to his cap. He knew how to diagnose a problem by sound alone. He knew how to work 12 hours without complaint and come home too tired to do anything but shower and sleep. He was good at it. He had been proud of it. Then Denise died. She had been gone 3 years now, and some mornings Marcus still reached for her side of the bed before he remembered. It had been sudden the way that cancer sometimes pretends to be sudden, months of small symptoms dismissed as stress and exhaustion, and then, all at once, a diagnosis that gave them 4 months instead of 40 years. Their daughter, Imani, had been 5 at the time. She was 8 now, and she still asked, some nights, whether her mother could see her from wherever she was. After Denise passed, Marcus had scaled back his hours so he could be the one to pick Imani up from school, the one to sit with her through nightmares, the one who learned, badly at first, then less badly, how to braid hair and pack a lunch that a picky 8-year-old would actually eat. He didn't regret a minute of it. But 6 months after the funeral, the elevator company he worked for went through a round of layoffs, and Marcus, newly part-time, newly unreliable in the eyes of a spreadsheet that didn't know anything about grief, was one of the names on the list. One missed paycheck became 2. Savings that had never been much to begin with disappeared into groceries, into a growing 8-year-old's shoes, into hospital bills that kept arriving in the mail long after the person they were for was already gone, as if grief needed paperwork to make itself official. Marcus had learned, in the hardest way possible, that being a good father did not stop the world from sending envelopes stamped final notice in red ink. So on a bright Monday morning in late spring, he put on the one dress shirt he still owned without a stain on it, combed Imani's hair into 2 neat puffs because he hadn't mastered braids fast enough for a school morning, and walked the 2 of them into the lobby of Ashworth Tower, the headquarters of Ashworth Global, a name Marcus knew mostly from billboards and the side of delivery trucks. Imani didn't have school that day. Her teachers were in some kind of training, and Marcus couldn't afford the $7 an hour sitter charged, not with rent due Thursday. "Stay close to me," he told her as they walked in, and she nodded solemnly, the way she did when she understood that today was one of the serious days. "I always stay close," she said. It was almost true. The interview, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. The facilities manager, a heavy-set man named Griggs with a lanyard full of key cards and the distracted energy of someone who had 6 more interviews before lunch, barely glanced up from Marcus's application. "No janitorial experience," Griggs said, more statement than question. I've cleaned every building I've ever worked in, Marcus said. Wasn't official, but I know how to keep a space right. Griggs didn't smile. That's not really what I meant. Marcus understood exactly what he meant. He nodded anyway, thanked the man for his time, and stood to leave, Imani sliding off the chair beside him and slipping her hand back into his. They were halfway across the lobby, Marcus already composing in his head the version of this he'd tell Imani to make it sound less like failure, when she tugged his sleeve and pointed toward the center of the atrium. Dad, look. He followed her finger. An elderly man in a motorized wheelchair had knocked his coffee cup off the armrest tray, and it had spread in a wide, glistening sheet across the polished floor. Dangerously close, Marcus noted immediately, to a floor outlet where a cleaning crew had left an extension cord running from a buffing machine. 3 employees in business casual stepped carefully around the spill on their way to the elevator bank, eyes on their phones, unbothered. Marcus didn't step around it. He crossed the lobby in a few long strides, grabbed a stack of napkins from the little cafe kiosk near the entrance without asking, and knelt down. First, he pulled the extension cord's plug from the outlet. Done before he even started wiping, muscle memory from a decade of work sites where the first rule was always eliminate the hazard before you clean the mess. And then he mopped up the spill with quick, practice motions, tossing the soaked napkins into a trash bin and going back for more until the marble was dry enough to trust. The old man in the wheelchair looked mortified. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I don't know how that happened. I usually no reason to be sorry," Marcus said, handing him the last clean napkin for his hands. "Could happen to anybody. Glad nobody stepped in it before I got here." From a mezzanine balcony on the 2nd floor, Renata Cole had seen the entire thing. She'd been on her way to a 10 o'clock with the finance team when something made her pause at the railing. Later, she would not be able to explain what exactly had stopped her, only that some part of her had simply needed to watch this stranger move through a crisis nobody else in that lobby had thought worth their attention. She watched him unplug the cord before touching the spill. She watched him kneel, without hesitation, in his one good shirt. She watched the little girl wait patiently by the cafe kiosk, hands folded like she'd done this before, like watching her father help someone was simply a normal part of any given morning. And when Griggs, 20 minutes later, dropped a small stack of rejected applications on Renata's assistant's desk for routine filing, Renata, who almost never involved herself in hiring below the executive level, who hadn't looked at a facilities application in a decade, found her eyes landing on a name near the top of the pile. Marcus Odom. That was when the pen slipped from her hand. Renata Cole was one of the wealthiest black women in the country, a woman whose face had been on the cover of business magazines, whose name was attached to scholarship funds and hospital wings and a foundation that had rebuilt 3 schools in neighborhoods the city had otherwise forgotten. But no amount of money had ever bought her the one answer she actually wanted. When she was 19, she had fallen in love with a young man named Elias Odom. Elias had been brilliant in the particular way of people who have to fight for every piece of their education, stubborn, proud, and poor, the kind of poor that meant he repaired radios and small appliances out of his mother's garage at night to pay for the engineering classes he took during the day at Georgia Tech. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. Renata had never met anyone who paid such close attention to the world, who could explain how something worked with such quiet joy that she found herself falling for the explanations as much as for him. Renata's father, Theodore Cole, hated him, not because Elias was cruel. Theodore would have respected cruelty, in his own strange way, as a kind of strength. He hated Elias because Elias had nothing, and Theodore Cole had spent 30 years building Cole Ashworth Holdings out of a single dry-cleaning business into a conglomerate with its name on a 40-story tower, and he did not believe that love was a luxury his daughter, his only heir, could afford to indulge. When Renata discovered she was pregnant at 20, she panicked in a way she was still, decades later, ashamed of. Her father found out before she'd worked up the nerve to tell Elias. He didn't yell. That was the worst part. He never yelled. He simply sat her down and explained, in the calm, reasonable voice he used to close business deals, exactly what would happen to Elias Odom's future and his mother's garage and his scholarship if Renata did not do exactly as she was told. Young and terrified and utterly unequipped to stand up to a man who had never once lost an argument in his life, Renata made the worst decision she would ever make. She let her father send her away to a distant cousin's house outside of Savannah, officially, to finish her studies somewhere quieter. She disappeared from Elias's life without a word of explanation, because her father had convinced her that a clean break, however cruel, was kinder than the alternative he'd threatened. By the time Elias tracked down enough information to learn the truth, Renata's father had already told him, through a lawyer, not even in person, that Renata had lost the baby during a difficult pregnancy. Complications, the lawyer said. Nothing more to discuss. Renata never saw Elias again. She heard, years later, secondhand, that he'd finished his degree, married, had a son, and died of a heart attack in his 40s, far too young. She had grieved him from a distance she'd never been allowed to close. She had built an empire in the decades since. She had never had another child. She had never fully trusted another man enough to try. And she had told herself, every single year on a date in October, that she never spoke aloud to anyone, that the baby she lost was simply gone, a sealed door in her past that no amount of money or power could ever reopen. Until a name on a rejected job application, Odom. Marcus Odom, 39 years old, the same age Elias's son would have been if Elias's son had, in fact, been Elias's only child. Renata told herself it was impossible. Odom wasn't such an unusual name. Names meant nothing on their own. And yet she could not make her hand stop shaking as she held the application, could not stop staring at the small, ordinary photograph stapled to its corner, required for security badges, evidently, of a tired man with kind eyes who looked, in the tilt of his jaw, unsettlingly like someone she had spent 23 years trying not to remember. Find him, she told her assistant, before he leaves the building. Now, Marcus thought at first that he was being called back because he'd done something wrong, taken initiative he hadn't been authorized to take, touched something he shouldn't have, made Griggs look bad in front of whoever ran this place. He kept running through it in his head as a security guard escorted him and Imani to a private elevator, the girl's hand tight in his, her eyes wide at the marble and gold and glass of a building unlike anything either of them had ever stood inside. The elevator opened directly onto the top floor. No hallway, no reception desk, just a vast office flooded with mid-morning sun, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole gleaming sprawl of the city. A woman stood at the window with her back to them, and when she turned, Marcus recognized her immediately from a magazine cover he'd seen once at a barbershop years ago. Renata Cole. So, owner, essentially, of half the buildings he'd once repaired elevators in. Imani clutched his hand harder. Renata looked at Marcus for a long moment before she spoke, long enough that it became uncomfortable, long enough that Marcus started rehearsing an apology for the coffee spill, for touching the extension cord, for whatever this was about. Did you know your father? She finally asked. Marcus stiffened. That's a strange interview question, ma'am. Something flickered across her face. Regret, maybe, or embarrassment. You're right. I'm sorry. He relaxed, just slightly, enough to answer honestly instead of defensively. My dad passed when I was 12. Heart attack. What was his name? Marcus's eyes narrowed, some old instinct telling him this wasn't casual curiosity, that this woman was asking a question she already half knew the answer to. Elias, he said slowly. Elias Odom. Renata closed her eyes. The room went very still, still enough that Marcus could hear the faint hum of the building's climate system, still enough that Imani, sensing the shift in the air the way children always do, looked back and forth between the two adults without understanding why neither of them was talking. Do you know my grandpa? Imani asked into the silence. Marcus gave a small, awkward laugh, trying to smooth over whatever this was for his daughter's sake. No, baby. She didn't know your grandpa. Yes, Renata whispered. I did. Marcus turned to look at her fully, and in that moment, the most powerful woman he'd ever stood in front of stopped looking like CEO at all. She looked like someone standing at the edge of memory she had spent decades trying to keep buried, and losing that fight in real time. Renata told him only part of the truth at first. She said she had known Elias when they were both young, that they had once been close, that his passing had affected her more than most people in her life would understand. It was a careful, edited version of decades of grief, and even as she said it, she knew Marcus could feel the shape of everything she was leaving out. Marcus lowered himself slowly into the leather chair across from her desk, Imani climbing into his lap, even though she was really getting too big for it. "My father never talked about you," he said. "Never mentioned anybody named Cole. Or Renata. Nothing. I didn't deserve to be talked about kindly," Renata said, and the honesty in it made Marcus more uneasy, not less. Then she asked the question that would unravel everything. "Do you have any family? Besides your daughter?" Marcus glanced down at Imani's head resting against his chest. "Just her. My mother passed 5 years ago. Never had siblings that I know of. What about Elias's family? His parents, cousins, anyone?" "None that I ever met. He was an only child too, from what my mom told me. His parents passed before I was born." Renata took a step closer, her composure cracking at the edges in a way that made Marcus grip Imani a little tighter, a protective instinct kicking, and even though he couldn't have said yet what exactly he needed to protect his daughter from. "Your father," Renata said. "Did he ever tell you where you were born?" Marcus frowned. "Savannah. To the hospital record and everything, my mom kept it in a folder my whole life. Coastal Memorial." "What?" Something in Renata's face changed completely. The careful composure gone, replaced by something closer to fear. Because Renata knew, with absolute certainty, that if the child she had given birth to 23 years ago in a private clinic outside Savannah, under her father's careful and expensive arrangements, had actually survived, that child would have been born in that exact hospital, on that exact date. Under circumstances her father had gone to considerable lengths to erase from every record he could reach. For the first time, Marcus felt something was seriously, dangerously wrong. "Ms. Cole," he said quietly, setting Imani gently down on her feet beside the chair, standing up himself now. "What aren't you telling me?" Renata opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She turned toward the door just as her assistant knocked once and stepped inside, carrying a thin manila folder, her expression carefully blank in the way of someone who has been trained never to react to whatever she's about to hand over. "You asked me to pull anything the archive team digitized from the Coastal Memorial acquisition," the assistant said. "This came back within the hour. I think you'll want to see it before anyone else does." Renata took the folder, opened it, stared at the first page. Marcus watched her hands begin to shake. "No," she whispered. He stood up fully now, Imani's small fingers finding his again, gripping tight. "What is it?" Renata looked up at him, and her eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. "Not yet. Not in front of him." "Marcus," she said, her voice barely holding together, "your birth certificate was amended when you were 3 months old." "My mother was sick after I was born," Marcus said, the words coming out automatic, rehearsed, the story he'd been told his whole life without ever once questioning it. "My father said there were complications during the delivery. That's why the original paperwork got redone." "There were complications," Renata said, "just not the ones you were told." The folder in her hands contained records from a private maternity clinic that had operated for decades outside Savannah before it was absorbed, along with its archives, in a Coastal Memorial's larger hospital system. An acquisition that Ashworth Global's legal division had quietly financed 2 years earlier as part of an unrelated healthcare investment. An acquisition that had, without anyone at the time realizing its significance, swallowed up a sealed adoption file that Theodore Cole had, paid a great deal of money to keep permanently out of reach. Inside that file, a maternity intake record, a signed release, a name listed under birth mother, that had been carefully whited out on every copy that had ever circulated publicly, but not, it turned out, on the original. Renata Cole. Marcus stepped backward, nearly knocking into the chair behind him. "No," he said. "No, there's some kind of mistake. Records get mixed up. This doesn't. I thought you died," Renata said, her voice breaking apart entirely now. "My father told me there were complications and that I lost you. I believed him. I believed him for 23 years. Marcus." Marcus stared at her like she'd started speaking a language he didn't know. He looked down at Imani, who was watching both adults with a wide, careful eyes of a child trying to understand something too large for the room. Then he looked back at Renata Cole, at the woman who had just told him that everything he understood about his own beginning might be built on top of a lie orchestrated before he could even hold his own head up. Renata Cole had not frozen in the lobby 3 hours earlier because she recognized the last name of a man interviewing for a janitorial position. She had frozen because the man standing in front of her, holding his daughter's hand, appeared to be the son she had spent 23 years mourning. 23 years believing gone. Marcus left the building without taking the job. He didn't remember walking through the lobby, didn't remember the elevator ride down, didn't remember anything except Imani's hand in his and the strange, hollow feeling of the ground shifting permanently beneath his feet. For 3 days, Marcus ignored every call from a number he didn't recognize, and after the second day, he started recognizing it anyway, because Renata Cole's office called with a persistence that bordered on desperation. Not aggressive, never rude, just steady, the calls of someone who could not make herself stop trying. He didn't want her money. That part, at least, was clear to him almost immediately, even through the fog of everything else. He'd grown up watching his mother, the woman who raised him, the only mother he had ever known growing up, work double shifts at a laundromat and then come home and still find the energy to help him with his homework at the kitchen table, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, her patience somehow endless even after 10 hours on her feet. Corinne Odom had not been rich. She had not been able to give Marcus everything he wanted, but she had given him everything that mattered, and the idea that some other woman, a stranger with a tower and a fortune and a father who had apparently orchestrated the erasure of an entire human being, could simply appear and rewrite the story of where Marcus came from felt like a theft, not a gift. He didn't want a mansion. He didn't want a management title he hadn't earned. And he genuinely did not know, 3 days in, whether he wanted another mother. Not when the only one he'd ever known had died 5 years earlier without ever once mentioning that the story of his birth might not be entirely true. Corinne Odom had raised him from infancy. He knew that much was not in question. Whatever else turned out to be a lie. She had packed his lunches every morning for 13 years. She had sat up with him through fevers and stomach flus, and, once, a broken arm from a bicycle accident that had scared her so badly she hadn't let him ride without a helmet again until he was 16. She had worked those double shifts specifically so he could have new shoes for the school year instead of the ones with the sole coming loose. She had loved him with a fierceness that had never once wavered, not for a single day of his childhood, and she had died without telling him that he might have been someone else's son first. Marcus didn't know how to hold both of those truths at once. He was angry at Renata, obviously, for the way she dropped this on him with no warning in a glass office 30 floors above the city. Angry at Elias, his father, who had raised him for 12 years and never once mentioned any of this. Though Marcus supposed his father might not have known the full truth either, might have simply been told the same lie everyone else had been told. Angry, in some shapeless, directionless way, at the world in general for taking his wife, and then his job, and then, just when he thought there was nothing left to take, coming back for the one thing he'd never questioned, the plain, simple facts of where he'd come from. And angry, if he was honest with himself late at night, after Imani had fallen asleep, at himself for wanting answers so badly that his hand shook every time his phone rang. It was Imani who found him on the third night, sitting alone at their small kitchen table with the lights off except for the one over the stove, a cold cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched in an hour. She climbed into the chair across from him in her pajamas, her hair wrapped for the night, and studied his face with a frank, unguarded attention only children seem able to manage. "Are you sad?" she asked. "A little," Marcus admitted, because he'd never been able to lie to her. Not really. Not about the things that mattered. Imani was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her small, serious mind. "Do you have 2 moms now?" she finally asked. "Like how some kids have 2 houses?" Marcus almost laughed. The sound surprised him, coming up through 3 days of tight-chested grief and confusion like something breaking loose. "I don't know, baby," he said. "That's a good question. I really don't know." Imani slid off her chair and came around the table to climb into his lap, The way she still did sometimes, even though she was getting long-legged and heavy enough that his knees sometimes fell asleep underneath her. She settled against his chest, and after a moment she said, with the simple, devastating clarity children sometimes have, "You can have one in heaven and one you just met." That's not two the same. It's just two different things that are both true. Marcus held her for a long time after that, his chin resting on top of her head, and for the first time since he'd walked out of Ashworth Tower, something in his chest loosened, just slightly. Children had a way of taking impossible things and making them sound almost simple, almost survivable, and Marcus found himself grateful, not for the first time in 3 years, that Imani had inherited more of her mother's steadiness than his own tendency to spiral. He didn't call Renata back that night, but he stopped ignoring the calls the next morning, and when her assistant reached him, he asked for one thing: a meeting on his terms, at a time he chose, with no cameras and no lawyers and no folders full of records he wasn't ready to look at again yet. Renata agreed to all of it without hesitation. He returned to Ashworth Tower the following Monday, exactly 1 week after he'd first walked in wearing his cleanest shirt to interview for a job cleaning floors. This time he came alone. Imani was back in school, and some part of him was grateful for that. Grateful he wouldn't have to manage his own unraveling emotions while also making sure his daughter felt safe in the middle of it. Renata was waiting for him in the lobby this time, not upstairs behind a desk. A small gesture, Marcus noted, and one that told him she'd thought carefully about how to make this feel less like a summons and more like a conversation between equals, whatever equal could possibly mean between a billionaire and a man who'd been rejected for a janitorial position 7 days earlier. She started to speak the moment she saw him, something rehearsed and probably apologetic building behind her eyes, but Marcus held up a hand before she could get the first word out. "I took the job," he said. Renata blinked, clearly not expecting this to be the first thing out of his mouth. The janitor job?" "Yes." "Marcus, you don't have to. I know I don't have to," he said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "That's not the point. I need to." He didn't fully know how to explain it to her, not yet. Not in a way that would make complete sense. The way his hand had been itching for real work for 3 days, the way sitting still with all of this new, impossible information felt unbearable, the way a routine, a purpose, a task he could complete with his own 2 hands felt like the only solid ground available to him right now. He needed the paycheck, still, that hadn't changed. Rent was still due, bills were still bills regardless of what DNA said about anybody's ancestry. But more than that, he needed something ordinary to hold on to while the extraordinary thing sorted itself out in whatever time it needed. Renata studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not quite understanding, not yet, but a willingness to try. She offered him, gently, almost apologetically, an alternative, a private office instead of supply closet, a coordinator position instead of mop and bucket, anything at all that his newly discovered mother's considerable resources could put in front of him. Marcus shook his head immediately. "I apply to clean floors," he said. "Don't turn me into a charity project because you feel guilty." It landed harder than he'd meant it to, and he watched Renata absorb the blow without flinching, watched her nod slowly, like she was filing the words away somewhere important. "That's fair," she said quietly. "That's more than fair." It was, though Marcus wouldn't learn this until much later, the first real lesson Renata took from the son she thought she'd lost. That love, if it was going to mean anything at all after this many years of absence, could not begin with control. Her father had tried to control her love for Elias 39 years ago, had decided he knew better than she did what her life should look like, and it had cost her both the man she loved and, she believed for over 2 decades, the child they'd made together. She was not going to make that same mistake twice. However badly her instinct told her to fix everything with money and titles and easy solutions. So Marcus Odom became a janitor at Ashworth Tower, the same building where 1 week earlier he'd been turned away for having no janitorial experience, and where an elderly man spilled coffee had somehow, impossibly, led him back to a mother he'd never known existed. Griggs did not know what to make of any of it. He'd been the one to reject Marcus Odom's application in the first place, a fact he was reminded of with excruciating frequency during the first week after Renata Cole personally instructed HR to reprocess it as an approved hire. Nobody told Griggs why. Corporate never explained itself to facilities managers. Not really, and Griggs had learned a long time ago not to ask questions that would only get him a vague answer from someone 2 pay grades above him and a permanent note in his file marked difficult. So he assigned Marcus to the 3rd and 4th floors, standard rotation, standard supply cart, standard blue polo with the Ashworth Global logo stitched over the breast pocket, and he watched. Everyone watched, at first, in the particular way that office buildings watch anything unusual, to see if the new guy would turn out to be somebody's nephew coasting on a favor, or somebody's mistake, or something else entirely. What they got, instead, was simply a man who was extremely good at his job. Marcus emptied trash bins and vacuumed carpets and wiped down conference tables with the same quiet, methodical competence he'd once brought to elevator shafts, and within 2 weeks the 4th floor had unofficially decided he was the best thing to happen to the custodial staff in years. He fixed a stuck window latch in a northeast stairwell that maintenance had been putting off for months. He noticed and reported a flickering light ballast that turned out to be an early warning sign of a wiring issue nobody else had caught. He remembered which conference rooms tended to run hot and adjusted the thermostats without being asked. Remembered which employees kept late hours and left the break room coffee pot on for them. Remembered because Denise had taught him this years ago in the small, quiet ways she'd taught him most of what he knew about kindness. That the people who moved through the world unnoticed were usually the ones who needed to be noticed the most. Griggs, grudgingly, started assigning him the trickier maintenance requests that came through the janitorial queue by mistake, the ones that technically belonged to a different department, but that nobody wanted to wait 3 days for facilities to schedule. Marcus never complained. He liked having his hands on something that needed fixing. It reminded him, in a strange way, of who he'd been before grief and layoffs had narrowed his life down to survival. Nobody on the 4th floor knew, of course, that the quiet janitor humming old gospel songs under his breath while he pushed his cart down the hallway was, biologically, the son of the CEO whose name was on the building. Renata had made that decision herself, and Marcus had agreed with it immediately and without argument. Neither of them wanted this to become a story, a headline, a thing people whispered about in elevators. It was complicated enough as a private matter. Neither of them had the appetite to make it public. Imani came with Marcus to the office most days after school let out, since his shift ran until 6, and there wasn't always someone available to watch her. Renata had offered, tentatively, in their second real conversation after Marcus took the job, to arrange child care, and Marcus had said, just as tentatively, that he'd think about it, and then never brought it up again because the truth was that having Imani nearby, doing her homework at a little folding table in an empty conference room on the 4th floor while he worked, was one of the only things keeping him steady through all of this. Renata found reasons, more and more often, to be on the 4th floor around 5:30 in the evening. The first time, she told herself it was a coincidence. A meeting had run long. She needed to stretch her legs. She happened to walk past the conference room where an 8-year-old was working through multiplication tables with the tip of her tongue poking out in concentration. Imani had looked up, unbothered by the presence of the woman who owned the entire building, and said, with the casual confidence only children possess, "Do you know 7 times 8? I keep forgetting it." 56, Renata said, and found herself sitting down across the small table without entirely deciding to. After that, it stopped being a coincidence. Renata started clearing her 5:30 calendar 3 days a week, and Imani started saving her hardest homework problems for the days she knew Renata would stop by, and neither of them mentioned this pattern to Marcus directly, though he noticed it anyway, watching through the conference room's glass wall as he worked his car down the hallway. Something complicated and unresolved loosening slightly in his chest each time he saw his daughter laughing at something the billionaire CEO had said. He wasn't ready, yet, to call Renata anything. Not mother. Not by her first name in any way that felt comfortable. Not anything except Ms. Cole, which she'd stopped correcting him on after the first week. But watching Imani take to her so easily, watching his daughter, who had lost her own mother at 5 and had every reason in the world to be guarded around new adults, simply decide, without ceremony, that this new grandmother was safe, did something to soften the anger Marcus had been carrying since that first afternoon in the glass office upstairs. 3 weeks in, Renata found him on his knees in a supply closet on the 4th floor, wrestling with a stubborn wheel on his cleaning cart that had been squeaking and sticking for days. "You could have asked maintenance to fix that," she said from the doorway, a little amused, a little something else she hadn't yet let herself name. Marcus didn't look up from a bolt. He was working loose with a small wrench he'd brought from home. "I was maintenance," he said, "before I was a janitor. Figured I could handle a cartwheel." Renata laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind she hadn't produced in this building in longer than she wanted to admit. She sat down on the floor of the supply closet next to him, in a suit that cost more than the cart itself. And for a while she just watched his hands work, the same steady, unhurried competence she'd watched from the mezzanine balcony 3 weeks earlier when he'd knelt beside a stranger's spilled coffee. "You do that with your whole self?" she said eventually. "Whatever you're fixing. I noticed it the first day, before I even knew who you were." Marcus glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then went back to the bolt. "My dad taught me that. Elias, I mean. The one who raised me." He paused. "He used to say, if a thing's worth fixing, it's worth fixing right, even if nobody's watching." He sounds like he was a good man. He was. Marcus finally freed the wheel, turning it experimentally in his palm to check the give. "I wish I could ask him about all this. About you. I keep wondering what he knew and what he didn't, and I'm never going to get to ask him. And that's," he stopped, exhaled, "that's its own kind of loss. On top of everything else." Renata was quiet for a long moment, watching him reassemble the cartwheel with steady, careful hands. For the first time since the day the pen had slipped from her fingers in the lobby, neither of them tried to fix the past. They simply sat there on the cold tile floor of a supply closet, two people with 39 years and 23 years and a lifetime of separate griefs stacked up between them, saying nothing at all, and somehow that felt like more progress than any of the careful, painful conversations that had come before it. The DNA results came back on a Thursday, 5 weeks after the coffee spill in the lobby. Marcus had agreed to the test, not because he needed convincing. The hospital records, once he'd forced himself to actually read through the folder Renata had first shown him, were detailed enough to leave little room for doubt, but because some part of him needed the science to say it plainly, needed a number and a percentage instead of only paperwork and a stranger shaking hands. Renata understood that need without having to be told. She'd requested the same thing for the same reason. They met in her office to open the results together, an appointment Renata had kept off her calendar entirely, telling her assistant only that she was unavailable between 4 and 5. Imani was down the hall in the conference room with a word search Renata had printed out for her that morning, unaware of exactly what was happening 2 doors away, though old enough by now to understand that something important was. Renata opened the envelope. "Read the first line," set it down on the desk between them without a word, and turned it so Marcus could read it himself. 99.97% probability of a first-degree biological relationship. Mother and son. Marcus read it twice, then a third time, though the number didn't change no matter how long he stared at it. He'd expected to feel something enormous. Relief, maybe, or a kind of closure, the sense of a question finally, permanently answered. What he actually felt was quieter and stranger than that, a settling, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't fully realized was still unlocked. "I need to know what happened," he said, finally, setting the paper down. "Not the short version. All of it. I need to understand how a person disappears a baby for 23 years and nobody says anything." Renata nodded slowly. She'd known this conversation was coming since the day the folder first landed in her hands, and she'd rehearsed it 100 times in her head in the weeks since, and every version of it still felt inadequate to the size of what she owed him. "My father," she said, "was not a cruel man in the way people usually mean that. He never raised his voice to me in my entire life. He didn't need to. He had a way of making his will feel inevitable, like weather, like something you didn't fight, because fighting it never occurred to you as a real option." She folded her hands on the desk, steadying herself. "When he found out I was pregnant, he didn't threaten me directly. He explained very calmly what would happen to Elias, that he'd make sure Elias never finished his engineering degree, never got hired anywhere in the state, that he'd bankrupt his mother's little repair business out of spite if I stayed with him. And I believed every word, because I'd watched my father do smaller versions of exactly that of people who'd crossed him far less seriously. So you left. I let him send me away. There's a difference, though. I spent a long time not admitting that difference to myself. I told myself I had no choice. The truth is I had a choice, and I was too frightened to make the harder one. She paused. I was moved to a private clinic outside Savannah under a false name on the intake paperwork. My father's lawyers arranged all of it. When you were born, I held you for exactly 4 hours. I remember every minute of those 4 hours more clearly than I remember most of the last 20 years. And then a nurse came to take you for what I was told was a routine newborn screening. And when she came back, she told me there'd been complications. Respiratory distress. That you hadn't survived the night. Her voice had gone very thin by the end of this. And Marcus watched her hands grip the edge of the desk, knuckles pale. It was a lie, she continued. I know that now. I believe, though I've never been able to prove it, and my father died 11 years ago, so I can't ask him, that he arranged the entire thing. Paid the clinic. Paid whoever needed paying. Had you placed for adoption through some private arrangement he controlled from a distance, and told me you died because a dead grandchild was a grief he could manage, and a living one, raised by Elias Odom, was a threat to everything he'd built. Marcus sat with that for a long moment, his jaw tight. And my dad, Elias, he adopted me not knowing any of this. I don't know how much Elias knew, Renata admitted. I've wondered about that more than almost anything else. Whether he suspected, whether someone told him a version of the truth, whether he simply grieved the loss of me and never connected it to the infant he and his second wife adopted 18 months later. I have no way of asking him now, and neither do you, and I think that's a grief we're both going to have to learn to carry without ever fully resolving it. My mother, my adoptive mother, Corinne, she never said a word. Not one word my whole life. She may not have known where you came from at all, Renata said gently. Private adoptions in that era, arranged through the right lawyers with the right money behind them, could be sealed tight enough that even the adoptive parents only knew what they were told. I don't say that to excuse anything. I say it because I think you deserve to know it's possible she loved you exactly as much as she seemed to, without ever having been part of the lie that separated us. Marcus exhaled, long and slow, some of the tension leaving his shoulders even as new questions settled into the space it left behind. I don't know how to feel about any of this, he admitted. I keep waiting to feel one clean thing, angry or relieved or grateful, something simple I could hold on to. But it's not simple. It's never going to be simple. No, Renata agreed. I don't think it will be, but I'd like the chance to find out what it becomes, if you're willing to give me that chance. Slowly, however slowly you need. Summer came, and with it a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both had grown to rely on. Marcus kept his job on the 4th floor, kept pushing his cart down the same hallways, kept fixing things nobody else had noticed were broken. Griggs, to his own quiet surprise, had started recommending Marcus for the facilities certification program the company offered, the kind of thing that could eventually turn a janitorial position into a supervisory one. And Marcus, cautious, but no longer instinctively suspicious of every opportunity that came from inside Ashworth Tower, had agreed to enroll. Imani turned 9 in July, and Renata hosted the birthday party, though hosted barely captured what actually happened. She'd asked Marcus, with visible nervousness, whether it would be allowed for her to help, and Marcus, watching his daughter's face when he told her the offer, hadn't had the heart to say no. The party ended up half in Renata's penthouse and half on the rooftop terrace, a bounce house incongruously set up beside a skyline view worth more than most houses. 11 8- and 9-year-olds from Imani's class shrieking with delight, while Renata Cole, in jeans nobody at her office had ever seen her wear, refilled a cooler of juice boxes with her own hands and asked Marcus, quietly, whether she was doing this right. You're doing fine, Marcus told her, and meant it. He still hadn't called her mother. Not out loud. Not yet. But in September, filling out a school emergency contact form for Imani, He found himself writing Renata's name and number in the second slot without hesitating over what to label the relationship. And when the school secretary asked, casually, how to note the connection, Marcus had paused only a moment before saying, "Grandmother." Put grandmother. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a clean, uncomplicated fairy tale where 23 years of separation dissolved into instant, easy family. Marcus still had days where the anger surfaced without warning, where he found himself resentful of a childhood spent in a two-bedroom apartment in southwest Atlanta, while, 40 minutes away, his biological mother had been building floor after floor of glass and steel. Renata still carried a grief that no reunion could fully undo. The 23 years she hadn't gotten to have. The version of Marcus's childhood she'd never see. The son who'd already grown into a man, already become a father himself, already built an entire life she'd had no part in shaping. Some losses didn't reverse just because the truth finally came out. They simply changed shape. But some evenings when Marcus finished his shift and came to collect Imani from wherever she and Renata had ended up, the conference room, the rooftop garden, once memorably the executive kitchen, both of them elbow-deep in flour attempting a recipe neither of them could actually follow. He'd catch sight of them together before they noticed him. His daughter's head tilted toward Renata's the exact same way Imani used to tilt it toward Denise, and something in his chest would loosen, just slightly, the way it had that first night in the supply closet. Two strangers, two family members, two people who had spent decades apart for reasons neither of them had chosen, learning slowly, through cartwheels and word searches and a birthday party with too many juice boxes. That blood alone could reveal a connection, but it took time and patience and a willingness to sit quietly on a cold floor without trying to fix anything at all, to turn that connection into something that actually resembled love. And sometimes, Marcus was beginning to understand, the greatest thing you could find after losing your way wasn't a fortune or a title or a dramatic, tidy second chance. Sometimes it was simply a person who was never supposed to be gone, sitting across from your daughter at a small folding table, helping her with her multiplication tables in absolutely no hurry to leave.